When Mrs. Johnson entered the restaurant, she immediately sensed that something was wrong. The familiar warmth that usually enveloped her felt noticeably absent. The cozy ambience she cherished seemed strangely distant today. Her eyes wandered around the room, absorbing the gentle murmur of conversations, the clinking of dishes, and the comforting aroma of freshly prepared meals. But instead of the usual friendly smiles from the staff, she was met with cold, dismissive glances. Something was off. Mrs. Johnson had been a loyal patron for years, celebrating birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet moments of reflection within these walls. Today was special. Her birthday. She had reserved a table just yesterday, expecting a pleasant evening filled with good memories. However, a sense of unease settled in her stomach as her gaze fell upon a new waiter behind the counter. He glanced at her briefly before returning to his notepad, wearing a frown that felt all too unwelcoming. Mrs. Johnson hesitated, trying to brush off her unsettling feeling. Perhaps the waiter was simply exhausted after a long shift. With her usual grace, she approached the counter, offering her gentle smile. "Hello, I have a reservation under the name Johnson," she said calmly. The waiter looked up, his expression flickering with irritation. "There are no tables available," he replied flatly, not even bothering to check the reservation list. Confused, Mrs. Johnson frowned slightly. "I called yesterday to confirm my reservation. Could you please check again?" The waiter sighed, his tone dripping with impatience. "I said there are no tables available," he reiterated, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. "You should try somewhere else." There was no apology, no explanation, just an overwhelming wall of indifference. A tightness gripped her chest, a familiar ache she had known all too well. She had encountered this kind of treatment before, the quiet dismissal, the unspoken judgment, but not here, not in a place she had come to love. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with disbelief. "Perhaps I can wait at the counter until something opens up." The waiter barely glanced at her, crossing his arms defiantly. "There's nothing for you here," he said with a smirk. "You should leave." Stunned by his coldness, Mrs. Johnson felt the weight of his words. There was a deeper disdain behind them, something she had felt her entire life, but had hoped was fading. His expression, his tone, his very posture, they all communicated a disdain she knew too well. It wasn't just about the absence of a table. It was about a long-standing judgment, one that cut deeper than any reservation issue. For a moment, she felt herself shrink under the weight of years of quiet endurance, of looking the other way. But she had learned that dignity wasn't something granted by others. It was something you carried within yourself. Straightening her back, she placed her hands on the counter. "Perhaps you don't know who I am," she said quietly, hoping to appeal to some sense of reason. Maybe he was just young and ignorant, not outright malicious. The waiter chuckled, shaking his head dismissively. "I don't care who you are," he said, his smirk widening. "There's no place for people like you here." His words hit her like a blow, the room seeming to shrink as the weight of his statement settled in. "People like you." She had heard those words before, felt the sting of them, but it never stopped cutting deep, especially here in a place she had always felt welcomed. It felt like betrayal. She looked around the restaurant, catching the eyes of other diners. Some glanced away quickly, while others continued to watch with expressions of curiosity and discomfort. She had never liked being the center of attention, but this felt different. This was not just about her. It was about every moment she had been made to feel she didn't belong. For a fleeting moment, she considered walking out. She was exhausted, tired of the endless fight, tired of proving her worth, tired of standing against the same old prejudices. Yet something inside her ignited, a fire that had never completely gone out, no matter how often it was tested. She wasn't just a customer. She was Mrs. Johnson. This young man, with all his arrogance and ignorance, had no idea who he was speaking to. Mrs. Johnson decided not to reveal her connection to the restaurant owner just yet. She wanted to see how far this young waiter was willing to take his disrespect. The restaurant, once her safe haven, now felt alien and hostile. But she refused to leave. She had every right to be here, a right she had earned, and she wouldn't let unkind words drive her away. Sensing her hesitation, the waiter leaned in, his smirk still in place. "Do you really think you belong here?" he scoffed, dismissively eyeing her worn coat and simple shoes. "This isn't your kind of place anymore." Mrs. Johnson's heart raced with anger, hurt, and defiance, but she kept her voice calm. "I'd like to speak to the manager," she stated softly but firmly. The waiter's eyes narrowed as she repeated her request, hoping it was a misunderstanding. She had always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, even when the signs suggested otherwise. But today, her patience was being tested. Instead of admitting his mistake, the young man's expression hardened, a sneer forming at the corners of his lips. "I told you already," he said, his voice now colder. "There are no tables available." Mrs. Johnson maintained her composure, refusing to mirror his rising hostility. "I confirmed my reservation yesterday. Could you check again, please?" She knew she was right. This wasn't just a mix-up. Something deeper was at play. The waiter sighed dramatically, as if her request were a grave inconvenience. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "You don't belong here," he said, his words dripping with condescension. "There are plenty of other places for someone like you." His judgment, which she had felt since stepping through the door, was now openly displayed. It wasn't about the reservation. It was about who she was and what he presumed she represented. He saw her as lesser, unworthy of occupying the space that was rightfully hers. The weight of his words hung heavily in the air, suffocating her. Memories washed over her, not from weakness, but from a lifetime of experiences. She recalled being a little girl, entering stores only to feel the weight of suspicious eyes on her. She remembered being told she couldn't sit in certain areas or that certain doors were off limits. As a young woman, she faced discrimination in the workplace, her skills overlooked, her worth questioned, all due to her appearance. These weren't just memories. They were scars she had buried beneath years of quiet resilience. Each incident had left a mark, small yet indelible. The waiter's tone sharpened, pulling her from her thoughts. "Why don't you just leave?" "You're wasting everyone's time," he said, his voice rising enough for others to hear. Mrs. Johnson glanced around, feeling the eyes of the other patrons on her. Their expressions were a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Some looked away quickly, others stared, as if waiting for her to break. She had felt this isolation before, the sense that no one would stand up for her, that she was alone in this moment. But she was no longer that young girl. Years of enduring similar treatment had taught her to stand firm. Her experiences had forged a quiet strength and resilience that couldn't be shattered by a few hateful words. She had fought too hard and come too far to let this waiter, or anyone else, make her feel small. The room felt like it was closing in, but Mrs. Johnson stood tall, her hands steady. "You don't need to raise your voice," she said, her tone soft yet firm. "I'm not asking for anything unreasonable, just the table I reserved." Her calmness only seemed to infuriate the waiter further. He stepped back, crossing his arms, smirking as if he had no intention of helping her. "I've told you," he sneered. "You're not getting a table." "I don't care who you think you are," the waiter sneered. A thick silence enveloped the space as Mrs. Johnson absorbed the full extent of his disrespect. His words felt like a slap, stinging not just because of their content, but due to the message behind them. He didn't see her as a customer or a person with dignity. He viewed her as an inconvenience, someone to be dismissed and reminded of her place. And the place he envisioned for her was far from where she stood now. She contemplated walking away, reflecting on the countless times she had turned the other cheek, allowing small humiliations to pass without a word. But not today, not here in a place meant to be a haven for everyone, especially her. Taking a deep breath, Mrs. Johnson resolved not to shrink under the weight of this moment. "I don't think you realize who you're speaking to," she said quietly, her voice steady and calm. She wasn't about to explain herself to him. Not yet. There was power in her words, a hope that they might make him pause, if only for a second. But the waiter didn't flinch. Instead, he laughed mockingly, shaking his head as if the idea that she could be important was absurd. "It doesn't matter who you are," he replied, his tone dripping with arrogance. "You're not welcome here." The finality of his statement hung in the air, cutting through any doubt or misunderstanding. This was personal. His prejudice and contempt were laid bare for all to see. Yet he showed no shame, standing there with arms crossed, daring her to challenge him. Mrs. Johnson felt frustration rising, a deep well of anger that had been buried beneath layers of civility. Instead of lashing out, she transformed that anger into resolve.